webinar on an exciting new tool, the Disaster Equity Data Portal. My name is Meg Duffy, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at Texas Appleseed. As you will hear, the Disaster Equity Data Portal represents years of work by Texas Appleseed, Fair Share Housing Center in New Jersey, Ayuda Legal in Puerto Rico, Texas Housers, the Home Coalition, and Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. The goal of this project is to make data on FEMA post-disaster individual assistance widely available and useful for advocates who are working to ensure that disaster recovery in their area is fair and fair and equitable. You can find the Disaster Equity Data Portal at disasterequitydataportal.org. Again, that's disasterequitydataportal.org today if you'd like to follow along. In just a few moments, you'll be hearing from Maddie Sloan, the Director of Disaster Recovery and Fair Housing at Texas Appleseed. She'll give an overview of the coalition that's been working together on the Disaster Equity Data Portal. Then you'll hear from John Laycock, Senior Research Analyst at Texas Appleseed, about the data that we've used to create the dashboards. He'll also provide a demonstration of the dashboards and a tour of the website. From there, we'll move on to a panel discussion. You'll hear from CJ Reynolds in Florida, Katherine Payne in New Jersey, Julia Orduña in Houston, Texas, about their experiences in disaster recovery and how they'll use the Disaster Equity Data Portal going forward. Ariadna Goudreau-Aubert was supposed to join us today, but unfortunately she could no longer make it. After our panel discussion, we'll have time for Q&A, so be sure to put questions in the Q&A bucket on Zoom. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Maddie Sloan for a history of the Disaster Equity Data Portal.
Thank you, Meg. As Meg said, the Disaster Equity Data Portal came out of a collaboration between advocates in Louisiana, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and Texas, all of whom have worked in various ways on improving disaster recovery, starting after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. We all started out responding to disasters in our own states, but we realized quickly that we were seeing the same problems, the same inequities, no matter where a disaster happened, and the same need for a more just recovery that didn't leave the most impacted families and communities out. One of the things that has become very clear as we've worked together is the need for access to data about who's being affected by a disaster, who needs help the most, and whether federal disaster recovery programs are getting help to those families and communities. Thanks to a grant from the Ford Foundation, we've been able to develop the Disaster Equity Data Portal to give advocates and communities access to FEMA individual assistance data that can help answer these questions, starting shortly after a disaster and going forward into the long-term recovery process. All of us know, unfortunately, that disasters are becoming more frequent and more devastating. Our current disaster recovery system wasn't built to deal with the reality of what's happening today. And it's not working for the families and communities that need it the most and are most at risk, especially working class and low-income communities and communities of color. Our organizations believe very strongly that every family and every community deserves a fair chance to recover quickly and completely after a disaster and to be better protected from the next disaster. We hope the data portal will be a resource for everyone working to make disaster recovery more equitable and more effective as that work becomes increasingly urgent and important to all of us. A just recovery is an effective recovery. And to introduce us to this tool, I'm going to turn y'all over into the capable hands of John Laycock. John?
Hi, Maddie. Thank you for that introduction. I certainly hope my hands are capable. With that, I'm extremely happy to present for the first time to the public the Disaster Equity Data Portal. This is a website that, as Maddie said, me and the rest of Texas Appleseed and a coalition of partners around the country have been working for 2.5 years, and I'm just so excited to finally get to publish it. I'll point out, I'm very proud to say that it is fully bilingual. All the resources are available in English and Spanish. We created, I started analyzing FEMA data, which I'll discuss in a little bit, and created these dashboards. And we wanted a place to host them. So the disaster equity data portal is going to take all the dashboards we created in one place. It also has other data and reports written by Appleseed and our cohort, and that we think is useful and will provide insight. And it will have an update page. It's a living website, so we will be able to continue to provide analysis of storms going forward, and we can host that on the data portal. We have a coalition of organizations from 3 states plus Puerto Rico. So we created dashboards for storms in 3 states plus Puerto Rico. So looking at Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And in just a minute, I will show you the Harvey in Texas dashboard. First, let's talk a little bit about the data that's informing these dashboards. We've mostly been using the FEMA Individual and Households Program data, the IHP. IHP is one of the most important recovery programs that the country has. It is implemented immediately after a disaster and provides housing assistance and other needs assistance to affected families. It's extremely important. It's the fastest way the government gets money in the hands of people who need it. It's also an incredibly rich data source. Every time a household applies for assistance, FEMA creates a row with their location, state, city, county, and zip code, household characteristics like the income of the household, whether they rented or owned, and the residence type, and the outcome of the application. Was the applicant approved for assistance? If so, how much assistance were they given? And if they were denied for housing assistance, what is the reason for the denial? And so this data has been collected and standardized since 2002. We have a database that is, as of June 2023, 21 million rows, and it grows by a few 100,000 to a few million rows every year. So this is a very rich, important source of data, and it's what fed all of our dashboards. So now we're going to look at the dashboard for Harvey in Texas. Hurricane Harvey hit Texas in August of 2017, dumped torrential rain all over the state, all over the coastal parts of the state, as well as wind damage and storm surge damage. 890,000 households applied for assistance after Hurricane Harvey. So if you want to see data visualizations of almost 1 million people, we have some for you. The first map I'm going to show you is a map of the distribution of applications adjusted by the number of households. So it's applications per 100 households. We think this is a good measure to approximate storm impact through a region. We understand that not everyone who's impacted is able to apply for individual assistance, but we think that on the whole, it represents self-identified need for the entire region. And we have this at both the zip code level and the county level. Darker colors represent more applications, more storm impact. And you can see if you look at the county level map, Aransas County and Refugio County are where Harvey made first landfall, and they're some of the most affected counties in the state, with 138 applications per 100 households. Harvey then hit Harris County before moving on to Southeast Texas, Beaumont region. If you look at Jefferson County, 71.5 applications per 100 households, and Orange County, 88 per 100 households. Harris County is lighter blue, even though it had torrential rain, almost 40 inches of rain fell over 3 days. and approximately half of all the applications were in Harris County. But it has so many people that even though it had 440,000 applications, it only had countywide 29 applications per 100,000 people. But if you look at the zip code map, you can zoom in to Harris County. This is where Houston is, incidentally. You can see in the Houston area, the zip codes are darker colors. These 3 zip codes in particular are Northeast Houston and the historic Ward 5. They were some of the most impacted zip codes in the entire state, with more than 90 applications per 100 people. So even if Harris County does not show up on the county map, looking more in depth at the region shows damage. The next map we're going to look at is the Social Vulnerability Index. This is the Social Vulnerability Index. It's created by the CDC and combines 16 census variables that collectively approximate a community's ability to recover from a storm. So these include poverty, unemployment, but also things like English proficiency, whether vehicles own a car, things that are important for in the midst of a disaster. So this data scored from 0 to 1. 0 is the least vulnerable and 1 is the most vulnerable. And it helps local and state officials identify communities that may need support before, during, or after a storm. So our third and final map combines these 2 maps, the storm impact map of applications per 100 households and the social vulnerability map. It's a 2-variable or bivariate map that divides the state and the region into 4 categories. We have high vulnerability, high damage areas, low vulnerability, high damage areas, low damage, high vulnerability areas, places that were farther away from the storm, but are lower income, otherwise vulnerable communities. And finally, low vulnerability, low damage. And this map forms just kind of a conceptual way of looking at a region and is useful context for disaster advocates and public officials trying to figure out where they need to prioritize resources. The final tab in the dashboards is called Equity and Outcomes. As we mentioned earlier, we have household characteristics. We also have the result of every single application, whether it was approved or not. If you look at the Harris County, if you look at the Texas applicant pool after Hurricane Harvey, exactly 50% were renters and exactly 50% were owners. If you look at applications by income, households that reported an income between $0 to $30,000, lower income households, were a plurality of the affected population at 42%. The result for these populations was different. Looking at owners and renters, owners were much more likely to be approved for assistance than renters at 47% to 37%. So that's a 10% greater difference. Likewise, eligibility by income. Households that earned more than $120,000, wealthier households were approved at 48%, which is 12% higher than households reporting no income at 36.2%. The total assistance amounts were also different based on socioeconomic characteristics. Owners received more money from the individual assistance program than renters. If you add other needs assistance and housing needs assistance, owners received more than $6,000 on average. Renters only received $2,000. This pattern is seen again in the assistance amount by income. Wealthier households received almost $7,000, and lower income households received closer to $4,000 in housing assistance. One thing that's one other statistic I want to call your attention to is rejections for failure to prove ownership. Historically, FEMA has required applicants to provide clear title of their home, legal proof that they own it to receive housing assistance, and this can be a barrier for many people. The rejection for failure to prove ownership was 2.6%, which means 2.6% of households that could have gotten housing assistance were rejected because they could not provide clear title. Because we can compare storms across years, we're gonna go look at a different storm, Hurricane Ida, to see if it had the same equity and outcome issues. Hurricane Ida hit Southeast Louisiana in 2021, right after I started working on these dashboards. It was the first hurricane to directly hit New Orleans since Hurricane Katrina, and it caused widespread damage across the region, including knocking the power out for up to 3 weeks. If you look at equity and outcomes, you can see, however, that unlike Texas, owners and renters were approved at similar rates, 67% to 63%. Eligibility by income also does not favor wealthier households. Here, households that earned more than $120,000 were approved at 62%. Lower income households were approved at 69%. So lower income households received more money, or were more likely to be approved than wealthier households after Hurricane Ida. If you look at the assistance amounts, you can also see lower income households, $0 to $30,000, received more money in assistance than wealthier households at about $2,000 to $500. And the same is true of owners and renters. Renters received slightly more money than owners. So we looked at some historic storms, but my vision for the site, as I said, is to be a living website, to be able to be a resource no matter when, for all future storms. So for instance, if a hurricane hit Jacksonville on August 1, there were a presidential declaration, and FEMA updated its data servers as they have been doing, we would be able to start mapping data by August 10. We would be able to start analyzing equity outcomes by the end of August, and we would have bivariate maps and vulnerability maps by the end of the declaration time. This is something we did for with Florida Housing Coalition. You'll hear from CJ in just a few minutes. After Hurricane Idalia impacted the Big Bend region of Florida this summer. And we just made a simple map of county level applications that also included information on ownership verification. Big Bend region in particular of Florida has a lot of mobile home units where it is particularly difficult to provide title. So this kind of information is useful for legal aid clinics and other planners trying to figure out how to provide assistance. So thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for letting me introduce my baby, my e-baby, as opposed to my literal child of the last 2 years. And with that, I will turn it over to Meg and our panel of national experts to talk about data use more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. As John said, we're going to turn now to our panel. Panelists, if you would come on camera. And I know we have live interpretation, so I'll try to go very slowly as I introduce all of us and get our conversation started. First, we have Julia Orduña. Julia Orduña is the Southeast Texas Regional Director of Texas Housers, whose mission is to support low-income Texans' efforts to achieve the American dream of a decent, affordable home in a quality neighborhood. She focuses on affordable housing, lack of access to safe and dignified housing, and climate change in Houston and surrounding areas. Her work in the organization shines a light on current issues pertaining to disaster recovery and how to address the housing need in a more efficient and equitable manner. Welcome, Julia. Katherine Payne is the director of course. Katherine Payne is the director of land use at Fair Share Housing Center, a nonprofit advocacy organization that uses legal, policy, and community building strategies to dismantle decades of racial and economic discrimination in New Jersey and nationally that excludes people that from the opportunity to live in safe, healthy, and affordable housing. Katherine collaborates closely with Fair Share Housing Center's attorneys, policy experts, as well as with external partners, advocates, and municipal stakeholders on affordable housing advocacy and Mount Laurel enforcement throughout New Jersey. She also works at the national level to help better incorporate equity into federal disaster recovery efforts and on how to incorporate climate resiliency into affordable housing planning. Welcome, Katherine. CJ Reynolds is the Director of Resilience and Disaster Recovery in the Florida Housing Coalition, a statewide organization that provides technical assistance to local governments and nonprofits. CJ has been working on climate change, disaster preparedness, and affordable housing since 2012. Currently, she serves as the co-chair of the state's Disaster Housing Task Force, supporting the Florida Division of Emergency Management. Throughout her career, CJ has focused on creating partnerships, developing new tools, and training to support data-driven decision-making, from quantifying impacts to understanding interactions and developing targeted strategies. Welcome, CJ. So as we've covered in all of your bios, each of you has a rich wealth of experience in working in advocacy and disaster recovery in your areas. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and how easier access to FEMA data can help in your work?
I can start. So, I mean, for me, easier access to FEMA data would really just make it easier for myself and other advocates and members of the community to be able to hold agencies accountable for where funding is going. We've already heard today that there is, and seen on the dashboard, that there is a long and unfortunate track record of assistance not going to the people and places where it's needed the most. We experienced that during Sandy, and I can talk a little bit about that more later, but you know, as advocates and survivors of disasters, we should be able to clearly see, without the need for a coding background or John's incredible data skills, how recovery funds are being allocated within our communities.
I completely agree. I think it's a lot about the visual of understanding where the impact is being had, like who is being the most impacted, and how are these households being assisted? Is this equitable, and is the social vulnerability of these communities being taken into account when we're trying to recover? We know that this money is being given to these communities so they can recover. And I think that we must use this money very particularly and precisely, and a lot of that means equitably. So knowing where the need is, knowing where the funding is going, and knowing who's being left out is very important to this work, not just in the moment, but when we're trying to reevaluate, did this work, who did it work for, and how can we do this better? So that's what data is definitely useful for.
I agree. Thank you for that, Tia, Julia. Our first exposure to the power of FEMA's data was through the state's Disaster Housing Task Force, and through our partnership with the FDEM Individual Assistance, who also was working directly with FEMA data teams to download and aggregate. And I said, you know, we understand there's a big difference between sort of support for renters and support for homeowners. Can we just see that aggregate data for the state, for the impact, this was right after Hurricane Idalia in October. And individual assistants went back and asked them. And the reason we asked for it is our office works with 130 state, local government, basically counties and large cities who receive state funding for hurricane housing, rental assistance, disaster recovery. So that comes in within about a 6 to 7 month timeframe. So they would have gotten individual assistance from FEMA, but now there's additional resources coming in, and this is long before the HUD disaster recovery. So from that, in early October of 2023, I also happened to be on a National Low Income Housing Disaster Recovery conference call, talking about issues of data and the importance of understanding aggregatedly what is going on and how we can better use diagnostics to create better recovery of allocation of resources, sort of a medical triage approach, if you will, to do the most good to optimize resources. And I met John, who then we, went through and learned more about what the Texas Appleseed and the cohort was doing. And I was blown away by the power of what this can do. And so we began brainstorming of the difference between the need for FEMA data from a legal services disaster case management perspective, and then how do housing recovery organizations, local governments, what kind of data do they need? And so that was the beauty of that partnership to help John see it from a different kind of advanced user perspective and help me think through that in our office, our team as well.
I think what it also does too is make the case for mitigation. If we are understanding where funding is going and what are the repeat communities that are constantly being hit, if we see that mapped out and see that data, we can make the case for funding to go to the places before the storm hits. And then hopefully we won't have to be in these situations. We know the storm is going to keep coming. The storms are going to keep coming, but if we have the infrastructure and planning available ahead of time, we can hopefully mitigate against some of the worst effects.
Absolutely. I like that you're highlighting that it's both important in the post-disaster context, but also mitigation. I feel like these dashboards have a lot of uses, but CJ brought up something that I wanted to ask you about, Katherine. CJ pointed out the difference between homeowners and renters and how she's seen some differences there in Florida. And it's been over 10 years now since Superstorm Sandy, which is wild to think about, but I know that you and Fair Share Housing Center did advocacy related to renters after the storm. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what that advocacy process looked like?
Yeah, definitely. So a big part of how, recovery decisions at the federal, state, and local level are made, including how to allocate resources, it starts with an assessment of damage caused by the storm, and FEMA is the agency who does that. But that data, in the case of Sandy, underestimated the needs of the lowest income survivors, which meant that fewer resources were going to the communities where they were really needed most. And since FEMA benefits go more often to homeowners than to renters, using FEMA data to make recovery decisions means that the decision makers and the people who are deciding where the aid is going are overlooking renters that were found to be ineligible. Sandy seriously damaged or destroyed over 55,000 homes, and more than 109,000 renters registered for individual assistance after the storm hit. That was about 40% of all of the homes that were impacted, and 2/3 of those renters were low income. But the state ended up creating a recovery plan, assuming that only 20% of the storm damage occurred in rental units, so undercounting the need of renters by half. And in addition to just undercounting the need, funding was allocated to renters in places that weren't actually the most hardest hit from the storm. Some of the developments that ended up being funded had little to no connection with Sandy, really, and the folks who got assistance would have had to move long distances to access those properties as opposed to returning to their home communities, which causes problems for things like community cohesion and maintaining connections, and having the resources around you in order to be able to survive and thrive. So we saw that in northern New Jersey, this also was, there were discrepancies from the geographic perspective as well. Northern New Jersey renters got about 25% of the damage, but nearly 40% of the funding. Ocean and Monmouth counties along the coast were much harder hit and received much less, a much lower share of the funding. And then for homeowners, the biggest problem was incorrect rejections. Data from the state showed that about 80% of applications that were initially rejected were actually eligible when they were reviewed on appeal. And Black and Latino homeowners were rejected as twice the rate of white applicants. So lots of inequities here that had real implications for people's abilities to rebuild their lives. So, so now I'm going to answer your question, which was that in 2013, Fair Share Housing Center this was before my time, but Fair Share Housing Center, along with the Latino Action Network and the New Jersey State Conference of the NAACP, filed a complaint with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, saying that New Jersey's initial recovery plan, the one that I had mentioned earlier, underestimated the impact of Sandy on renters, particularly low-income Black and Latino renters, and wasn't allocating funding fairly. So a lawsuit in 2013, later that year, forced the state to turn over data about the criteria that was used to distribute funding. And that data showed that exactly what I had said before. Black applicants were denied housing assistance at more than twice the rate of white applicants. There were additional issues too, like inaccurate funding information that was included in Spanish language materials. And funds were directed towards projects that were not damaged by the storm instead of going to those renters in those most impacted counties. This resulted in the largest ever federal fair housing settlement in history. It created a $500 million program to rebuild or replace about 7,000 affordable rental homes that were damaged by Sandy or destroyed. And the state said that they would distribute more funds to the hardest hit communities. They set up a rental assistance program, and they ended up allocating more funding to special needs housing as well. So determining this massive discrepancy in aid allocation was only possible to calculate because of access to data. And nothing like this wonderful database existed like that at the time. It took a literal lawsuit and a lot of advocacy work went to really understand how that aid was being allocated. And at the time, FEMA wasn't collecting demographic data like race and ethnicity, which would have really gone a long way to understanding the impact of all of these funding decisions. So yeah, information is power. Basic transparency on all of this would really go a long way toward understanding where aid should be allocated and where it's really going. So we won't have to have a huge settlement to try to correct a problem where it shouldn't really have existed in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that example really provides a clear view of the accountability piece that you talked about early on. We need this data to hold agencies accountable and to make sure that the distribution of funding is fair. You also brought up so this data set's very rich, and we provide charts and spatial distributions or visualizations of the spatial distributions of FEMA applications, but there are shortcomings like the lack of racial data. We're hopeful, and FEMA has said that they're going to start collecting that, but it's not publicly available yet. And so that's clearly still a gap that remains. But Julia, I wanted to turn to you. The data showed some pretty sharp disparities in Houston and Harris County, with high-income homeowners being accepted at higher rates by FEMA individual assistance and also receiving higher dollar amounts in benefits. You've worked for years on the ground with Houstonians in disaster recovery. So how did these dashboards match your experience on the ground?
Yeah, I do think that the data, as we've been talking about, reveals a lot of the lived experience. Like we're saying, who is applying, to what rates are they getting accepted, who is being denied. And I think that what we see there is a lot of the time homeowners that are a little more affluent, have income, tend to have more resources in their possession. Were they able to move to a hotel instead of having to double up with a family member? Were they able to have access to technology, to scanning their documents? Were they able to save the documents or already have these, all these documents that FEMA needs in order to apply to successfully get through the application process and receive an award? Unfortunately, when we're talking about lower income communities, they don't have the tech access or savviness sometimes. Sometimes they don't have the documents saved. And sometimes when they're displaced, what we really saw with Hurricane Harvey was that a lot of families were doubling up. So when they were applying with the same address because that's where they were living in the moment. And they were actually being denied because of procedural issues, not because they were actually ineligible for the assistance. And we see a lot of that through the data, or we can start piecing these puzzle pieces together to really understand the lived experiences of the people that we're trying to assist through these federal funds. I do think that we see, like John showed, that low-income people tend to get less support from the federal government and from these programs. We did do some research on FEMA AI in Hurricane Harvey, and we saw that a lot of the denials were because of document errors or missing IDs, something very simple that could have been remedied in any way. And I think what we can see from that is, what are some of the things that we can do to change the way that we're doing outreach, to change the way that we're navigating in these communities, to be able to equitably make sure that this assistance gets to the people that deserve it and that most need it. And I do think, and when we're talking right now about renters, Katherine was talking about renters and the civil rights. Texas Housers actually was really active during Hurricane Ike in 2008. And we saw that renters significantly were left out of assistance. We fought with renters to put a civil rights complaint against the state of Texas and towards the federal government. And the state actually was able to do the DHAP, the Disaster Housing Assistance Program that was assistance for renters. Unfortunately, that was the only instance that they managed DHAP, and we didn't see DHAP activate during Hurricane Harvey. So we learned from one disaster how to do something better, but then we didn't implement those lessons in the following disaster that happened almost a decade later. Disasters are happening more often, and we need to learn much more quicker and really implement these lessons learned much faster, not just in Texas, but now we're seeing that this is happening in Louisiana, in Florida, in North Carolina. How do we learn from all of these places and really focus equitably in how to support the communities and how to get them the resources that is available to them? Not that that is necessary, but it's available to them, and they should be able to have access to these things. And that is what equity really is.
Absolutely. It really changes the game when you can see these trends in real time. And I wanted to highlight something that you said, which was about rejection methods or rejection codes. So there's over 30 reasons why FEMA rejects people under FEMA individual assistance, and to look at the reason why and understand how people are being weeded out as they're applying for assistance is incredibly helpful. And that's something that, is a really exciting function of the dashboards. But we've been talking a lot about distribution in post-disaster. In the post-disaster phase, I want to think long-term with CJ. So I know that you've worked with state and local officials in long-term recovery planning after Hurricane Idalia. Can you tell us more about that process?
So this has been a great resource, even as it just got up and running perhaps last month or so in ours. And we did a webinar to communicate the Florida-specific dashboard out. And my colleague Lauren, who works with me, she's been doing the demos to county organizations, long-term recovery groups, to use the dashboard as a visualization of what is going on in your jurisdiction, and then to say, how are you coordinating with requesting the FEMA PII data if you're going to be doing this? And that has really stimulated conversations. And then most recently, in fact, just this past Friday, we met with the states, the disaster case management companies, the contractor who manages all of the disaster case management companies that are they are boots on the ground. And so that those companies have just been named and haven't yet gotten connected and gotten their own PII data. So we were able to show one of the regions, DCM, the dashboard and help him see that it would be useful for training for the DCM employees who are now getting onboarded to get a sense of the aggregate impact by county, by type of assistance that's going to be needed. And then it's really a way for people to just come to terms with the scale of what's going on, or by type of income and resident and type of housing. I think one of the things that is going to be a long-term assist on this is because now we know, because now these tools are out, the next disaster that hits, and we just got this update, there's like, what, 23 named storms projected for this coming season, right? So we hope no one gets hit, but that it will, the ability to execute one of these new dashboards faster. So by the time FEMA registration closes within 20 days, 30 days, I think with the right funding, John's has the ability to do that, to give us even better, shorter diagnostics. So it can both advise as we go, but it can also speed up and enhance coordination needs. So once we get that information, and I think it's quite valuable for identifying specific types of housing gaps. As you were saying, one last thing on that one is the issue of what, you know, the theme of how these tools help us uncover what things haven't been effective in the past. And FEMA is constantly changing and working to try to improve the issues and rejection of air title. This year, we see more flexibility. The new update in February also allegedly created additional ways to make it easier for people to get assistance without certain documents. One of the things that the dashboard really helped us understand is a huge aspect for all of us, is that when FEMA does, and this gets to rental properties that are single family homes or manufactured housing, mobile home rental properties, there's no documentation of the damage levels for those properties. And in rural areas in Florida, those homes make up a substantial portion. There's not a lot of apartment buildings in rural parts of the state, right? So we have older single family homes, lots of older manufactured housing units that somebody owns and rents at a rate that's probably not market rate, right? It's not downtown St. Pete or downtown Miami. And so these are naturally occurring affordable housing, to use a terrible term. And there's no documentation because FEMA doesn't, because it's requirements of the act or policy, FEMA does not collect the actual physical damage to the housing unit. So we get the damage report for the renter inside there who had, you know, damage to their personal property, but there's a whole set. So when you spoke of unmet needs earlier, this is where I think one of the things we can do both through our collaboration with National Income Housing, research, policy advisory component, where if FEMA is already in that unit collecting damage information for that renter, we ought to be collecting the damage on that property, because then we have a better picture of needs. Now, who owns it? A lot of the housing recovery programs are not set up for, you know, when it's not owner occupied, but yet we have a lot of renters living in those things. So you can see already an inherent disconnect because of that. So we hope to work on some of those things. Sorry for the long-winded story about long-term recovery. So.
No, absolutely. I feel like our time is flying by on this panel, but there's somehow only 12 minutes left for our discussion today. Panelists, thank you very much. If you guys would be open to staying on camera, we're going to go into a Q&A session. I'm going to invite John Laycock, Senior Research Analyst at Texas Appleseed, back on screen too. We've been very fortunate. The audience has participated quite a bit, and we have a few questions lined up. I'll try to address them to whoever makes the most sense, but if you have opinions on the particular topic, feel free to chime in. The first question that we received from Brian Russell is, does this new portal have any data related to those with a disability or access and functional needs? And so I'll toss this over to John.
Thank you, Brian, for that question. It's the answer shortly is no. But I know that FEMA data does record whether an applicant household had special needs. One thing that is very exciting about the data portal is the opportunity for collaboration. I think once we have a good hold on the data, we can start working with advocates and communities to figure out exactly what they need to know. So I'd be very happy to collaborate with you, start looking at denial rates for special needs applicants. I think this is something that we did with Florida Housing Coalition.
What was your question, John? Oh, no, it looks like we lost John.
Sorry, did I disappear for a second?
But now you're back.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so we are happy to collaborate to finish that answer.
Absolutely. I would just add that, as John noted, FEMA will ask people whether they require functional needs assistance when they're filling out an application, but it's a very imprecise measure of disability. Many people have disabilities that won't make them require assistance for an application, or people have assistance, they have friends and family who can help them fill an application. So it's kind of an imperfect proxy for disability. So if there's anyone listening out there who wants to help us get more and better data on disability as it relates to disaster recovery, that's a very serious need. Brian also asked, has there been any data showing assistance applications and denials among those with disabilities? John, do you want to take that one, or? Oh, we may have lost John again. I think it's a similar answer, though, that we only have the access functional needs question. That's sort of the only proxy we can use. I don't think that John is back. It's looking like he's frozen. All right. So I'm actually going to turn the final question from the Q&A is there a public API for process data that backs the visualizations, something that might support third-party investigations into questions that require more data than what was available to you guys? That's a great question. So FEMA does have an API for FEMA individual assistance. Also, for each individual storm, we will make public the data that's used on the dashboards, and you'll be able to get that through Tableau. Oh, John, sorry, you're welcome. Welcome back, and please feel free to add. This question was about APIs for the data that backs these visualizations.
Yeah, there is a FEMA data API, and we know we are working with people who have more computer science skill than me to implement it. And I know Amanda Brown is on here from LA Lagniappe Law. She's very, she has done some really excellent work with APIs and individual assistance. So that is something that we're looking towards and will develop on.
Absolutely. We have one final Q&A question, which is, will this webinar be sent to us? And absolutely, it will. We have 2 more minutes, so I want to open it up to our panelists in case you have any closing thoughts about the dashboards or your hope for more and better data in the future.
Well, just talk about what's another aspect of the collaboration, which is in process with Florida Housing Coalition and Texas Appleseed and John, is that we understand the issue of homeowner insurance and recovery to be a huge issue. And we think it is another piece of the social vulnerability piece. And so that data is available through FEMA. And so we're going to work with John to see what we can learn from different filters of that. And that may be something that gets built out in future for other pieces of it. We've learned that there's been maybe 30 to 40% of people in a certain area may not have insurance that are applying. And so this further helps us to understand the scale and the impact of local and philanthropic resources that will be needed for recovery.
I'm a firm believer of centering the community in all of this. And I think that the data really helps us find where those people are and ask them point blank, what do you need? what is helpful to you, and how can we better make these things accessible to you. And I think the data really will bring around that opportunity to brainstorm equitable outreach approaches. And I really like how Katherine painted it at the beginning, mitigation. This is a cycle of disaster recovery, and every time we end one, we're actually starting at the beginning again. And so how do we continue to evaluate and bring all of the necessary resources to the communities who need it most? And we know about the repeatedly affected communities. We don't want to continue to flood. We've heard that directly from them. And so how do we make sure that they do not continue to flood, do not continue to be impacted? And we really address that unmet need. So I think the data is most valuable, and not just within one particular storm, but seeing things longitudinally. Right now, we're only seeing the data in one storm per state, but as this portal, as John was saying, continues to progress and evolve, I think we're going to start seeing those repeated communities, those people that continue to be left out, and how do we continue to work towards a more equitable recovery.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Texas Appleseed for convening this group and shepherding this process and really leading this whole effort. This is a lot of work with very confusing and frustrating data sometimes, and we are just so very grateful. You are making something very complex, very user-friendly for all of us, and like we've all talked about, there are so many applications for this and so many places it can go in the future. So onward and upward. This has been wonderful.
Thanks, Katherine. I'd also add a shout out to Maddie Sloan. She was here at the beginning, but really could not have done any of this without her guidance and her mentorship. So thank you very much to Maddie. And to all the panelists. You did a brilliant job and you make me look smart, and you know.
Absolutely. Thank you to each of our panelists. And John, if you wouldn't mind bringing up the slides, we have contact information where you can reach out with comments and questions about the Disaster Equity Data Portal. Again, you can find it at disasterequitydataportal.org. Thank you again to Julia, Katherine, and CJ for your insightful comments today. And we really look forward to collaborating and presenting the Disaster Equity Data Portal going forward. Thank you, everyone.